Hi friends, Angelica Veneta, co-chair of Inclusive ICR. We are a coalition of over 220 employers in Eastern Iowa, all working together to grow the diversity and inclusion of our workforce, to create a space where employees feel a sense of belonging, included, and valued. Inclusive ICR is a proud sponsor of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion track of the Iowa Ideas Conference. As you participate today, be sure to connect with other Inclusive ICR champions, as we'd love to share information with you about our upcoming coalition meetings, projects, and how our work is impacting positive social change in our region. Be sure to visit our website at inclusiveiowa.org for information on upcoming events and to sign up for our e-newsletter. Thank you and have a great conference.
Okay, well, welcome to Uncertain Enrollment. This is session number 4 in the higher education track of the Gazette's Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm your moderator, Sarah Conrad Baranowski, managing editor at the Gazette. I'd like to recognize Iowa Ideas presenting sponsor, ITC Midwest. Thanks to them for making this session and the entire 2-day conference possible. During our time together today, we'll talk with our panelists and address audience questions. If you have a question at any point during the session, you can type it into the Q&A box and our tech host will forward it to me, and then I can ask our panelists. This session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. If you have any tech questions during this session, put those in the chat box and the tech host will address them. All of our sessions, except for one of our keynote addresses, is being recorded and will be available on iowaideas.com. Some of them will be there today, but by early next week, we'll have all 55 plus panel discussions up on the website. So let's get started. I am joined today by 2 panelists. They are Jason Pontius, Associate Chief Academic Officer at the Iowa Board of Regents, and Jerry Parker, Vice President and Dean of Students at Drake University in Des Moines. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting us.
Jason, we're going to start with you. I'll ask you to kind of set the stage for us. Can you share what's happening to higher education enrollment in Iowa and tell us a little bit about when you started researching this and what you're looking at?
Yeah, so in 2018, Nathan Graw put out a book called Demographics and the Demand for Higher Education. And that book started a little bit of probably a panic in higher ed, and in it, who was predicting large decreases in the number of students going to college over the next about 20 years. So he was predicting about 15% drop in the college number of students at attending colleges across the entire country, and it varied quite a bit from state to state. In particular, areas of the Northeast looked particularly hard hit by this decline. And what was driving it was the Great Recession. So he was going back in time, looking at a decline in the birth rate during the Great Recession, and then just predicting or looking 18 years into the future and seeing that drop in birth rates equaling a drop in high school graduates. And how that, and he was trying to ask the question of is this going to affect colleges? So we are 1 year away from that enrollment cliff, as it's been called. Next year should be one more point of like a little bit higher number of high school graduates, but that's going to be the peak before we begin, a multi-year decline. It's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster ride going forward. What's interesting, though, is when I talked about this with some of the folks that I work with at the Iowa Department of Ed, they said, well, we're not seeing a decline at the K-12 level. And frankly, they should be at this point. So we went back and looked at actual enrollment at the K-12 level in Iowa, and we're not really expecting to see that much of a decline in the state of Iowa. And the disconnect here is that GRAW was using American Community Survey data, which is a Census Bureau survey, which uses small samples of groups from each state. And because Iowa's a relatively small state and you have a relatively small sample, his numbers are a little bit off, I think, for Iowa. What we're expecting to see is another increase for the next probably couple years in Iowa, and then about a 5-year period of decline. But at its lowest point, we should be still a little bit above where we were at in 2019, so pre-pandemic. Turns out this seems like great news, but there's a whole lot of other things going on to add to the mix. Part of this is that our college going rate among high school graduates has been dropping steadily. And this has started even before the pandemic. So in 2012, 69% of Iowa high school graduates were going on to college in some form. In 2022, that had dropped to 60% of high school graduates, so a 9 percentage point drop over that period. And it's been fairly steady every year. It seems maybe have moderated in the last year or so, but we're still not totally sure. Add on top of that, some states are going to get hit particularly hard by this enrollment cliff, even though Iowa's going to be okay. That's going to set up a lot of states looking to places like Iowa, like, hey, maybe we can poach students from that state to bring them into our universities. And then, as you're very aware, we've been going through a COVID pandemic, which had some impact on our college enrollment. And over the last year, we had FAFSA, which has certainly made things more difficult. And as a result, you're starting to see some really small colleges fail, particularly colleges like colleges of the arts that are under 1,000 students. But all those things are are combining to create a pretty uncertain environment for an awful lot of colleges and universities in the country.
You set it up like it was going to be very hopeful at the beginning there that we weren't facing the birth rate declines. Is there any chance that this enrollment, I mean, Iowa's numbers seem to differ enough from those other national numbers, or at least the larger states. Like, are the other states going to bounce back, and might that mean Iowa would also increase, or are we kind of steady?
Well, I mean, right now we can use if we're using some of the enrollment data at the K-12 level, we are going to basically be hitting a peak in 2026, kind of dropping down to like 29, 2030 of kind of the low point, and then we'll come back up again, only in time to go back down a little bit again. So it's just going to be that up and down effect that I think we're going to see for the next 20 some years, uh, not only in Iowa, but other states. Now, just to kind of put a comparison sake, over that same period of time, whereas we're going to be fairly stable, states like Illinois, which is going to be one of the hardest hit, is showing a 24% decline in the number of high school graduates over the next 20 years. Wisconsin, a 10% decline, Missouri, somewhat similar. And again, as I said, like those states, if they've got colleges that are low on enrollment, they're going to look for places where they can get better enrollment. And so they might come after and start asking our students to try to leave the state.
Right. And when it's Illinois and Wisconsin, they wouldn't have to travel that far to get there.
That's right.
Um, Jerry, I wanted to go to you. Jason's work has looked mainly at Regents universities, I think. Jason, is that correct? I mean, you're looking at trends across higher ed, but your specialty is looking at the Regents. Um,
Right.
and Jerry, you've been at Drake for, is it more than, I think you'd said 11 years.
Correct.
What are you seeing there? Are you seeing the same kind of uncertain enrollment, or the kind of up and downs, maybe you're not getting as many students as you used to be able to?
We are. And I think that's not just a Drake thing. That's for other private institutions in the state. Jason's exactly right, looking at some of the enrollment trends, looking at the demographic shifts that the Regent institutions are facing, private schools are facing too. I mean, you look at Regent institutions enrollment, they're about 70,000, Jason, I believe. Private institutions here, we're just under 50,000. And we've hovered around that 50,000 mark for some years, for at least the last 5 years. I think 2019, we were about 51,000. Now we're around 49,000 altogether when you take all the private institutions into account. And so what we are seeing is greater competition amongst the private schools, but also the public institutions. This year's financial aid snafu, I guess, would be the way to call it snafu. That did derail a number of institutions from hitting enrollment goals. When it comes to a private school, parents, guardians, students, they're looking to get those financial aid and scholarship award letters out and to see what they're going to be receiving in order to make that decision. Whereas if they don't get those in time, the likelihood of them going to a Regent institution just goes up from there. You're seeing more competition, as I already stated, in regards to private institutions, trying to compete and stay competitive for those students that are here in the state of Iowa, but also from the surrounding states. Illinois, for example, the demographic shifts that are happening there, Illinois has become very competitive. Whereas Illinois used to be a very strong placeholder for an institution like Drake, that has gotten much more competitive for us, where we've had to change up some of our recruitment tactics and so on. So yes, we are experiencing those things. When I talk to my counterparts at other private institutions, we're all facing it in some way or another in regards to either a few schools have seen either a slight increase in their enrollment or a slight decrease in their traditional age enrollment, where you see some institutions separating is, are they recruiting transfer students to offset some of those declines? And so for an institution like Drake University, we've had two record years when it comes to transfer students coming into Drake. So that has really helped us out along with our professional and graduate programs.
So we've talked about in terms of numbers and the challenges of recruiting students and what this, declines in enrollments, but what does this mean for an institution like Drake not everybody here works in higher ed. I'm
Sure.
assuming we have some audience members who are just tuning in who are not in that realm, but what does that do for an institution?
Sure. For institutions that are private here in the state of Iowa, we have to be as resourceful as possible with the resources we receive. And we are a tuition dependent institution. Yes, we have an endowment to offset some of those scholarships that we provide our students. But by and large, we are resource dependent on the enrollment of our student body. And so when it comes down to the recruitment, that is one significant aspect, but not only that, it goes to retention of those students. So those students that we actually bring into the university, we have to do everything we can to retain those students. So Drake is not the only school that had a headline this past spring in regards to budget deficits. A lot of schools have been navigating those deficits based on some of the enrollment trends that we've been seeing. And so for us, it's making some of those hard decisions, but decisions that stay true to what our academic mission is. And then also being an institution that is accessible to students. So, even though our entering first year class is smaller than it was last year, we saw the largest increase in our Pell recipients, largest increase in our first gen students. Our diversity, we had over 37% of our incoming class have some category of diversity. And that's the largest diverse class we've had in our history. So as we look at some of these downturns in the larger number, we're also seeing some of the upward trends that is also part of the equation, and it has to be. So private institutions, by and large, also need to be accessible to the population here in the state of Iowa.
Jason, I'll ask you the same question with the regents. Like, what challenges does this present to the fluctuating numbers or maybe the decline of student numbers? I believe there was a slight uptick for all three of the universities this year. But still there's some uncertainty there. How is that challenging to the regents' universities?
One of the things that we've been seeing is states around us in particular, like Illinois sends about 10,000 students a year to the regent universities, and they are seeing their population declining. And so they are out offering all sorts of scholarships, merit-based and otherwise, to keep students in the state because they don't want to lose any more than they already are. So that does make trying to attract out-of-state students much more competitive. Luckily, as I've been tracking the numbers through like National Student Clearinghouse, Iowa high school students are staying in the state, which is a great thing. Those numbers have actually increased a little bit. Those who are going to college are about 87 to 88% are staying in the state of Iowa for college, which is great. It's a blessing for us. Illinois has traditionally lost about 30,000 of their high school graduates every year to other states. And so we're lucky in that sense, but it does. It's upping the competition. We have some advantages built in that were relatively low tuition. That may come as a surprise to some viewers because they see the sticker prices, but in comparison to other states, we're actually more reasonable. The example I can give would be like if you're looking at a Big Ten university, in-state University of Iowa is 24,000, University of Minnesota Twin Cities is 34,000, and Wisconsin-Madison is like 30, I think 39,000. So, oh, sorry, no, just 30,000. But those are kind of that sticker price cost of attendance. But even if for out-of-state kids, if you're not from Iowa, University of Iowa is at 45,000 cost of attendance versus 59,000 or 61,000 for Minnesota and Wisconsin. So we offer that. That's where we have some baked-in advantages, I think. But again, still more competition for the same students.
Yeah. One of the factors that you mentioned, Jason, in the opening was just behavior of high school students and what they're deciding to do after high school. Jerry, I wondered what factor did COVID play in these enrollment changes? You're in close contact with students. We were just talking about it before we started this session that you talk to students all the time. What have you noticed? How are their preferences or their expectations? How have they changed maybe as a result of COVID or maybe just changes that you've seen from 2019 to 2024?
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you that it's been a significant change in the sense of pre-COVID, during COVID, and then post-COVID. If we want to consider post-COVID, the new term that's out there. But by and large, I mean, you look at an institution like Drake where historically 30% of our incoming class came from Iowa. This year, we were over 40% of our incoming class coming from the state of Iowa. And so what that's showing is this pattern that continues to play true, that students are deciding to stay closer to home if they do ultimately decide to enroll at a college or university here in the state. And so we're a direct beneficiary of that, being here in the state capital, Des Moines, where we're continuing to see growth in our metro area, and we're recruiting more Des Moines students from the metro area to come to Drake. So with that mindset of wanting to stay closer to home, that has been advantageous for us. And then we have then looked at, okay, do we place several more recruiters just here so that we can build on those partnerships with students, with their families, in order to try to enroll them here in the institution. I could say a number of different things during my conversations with students. I will tell you this class, out of the last three post-COVID, so to speak, this class is more sociable. They have they're more joyous than the previous cohorts that have come through because they've had less interruption within their academic experience. They might have navigated 1 year of COVID either between middle school and high school, but they haven't had that full duration that the previous cohorts and classes have had to try to overcome. And so we're seeing that by and large. Mental health is playing an impact on student enrollment. That is actually playing a significant impact. Going back to a previous statement earlier in our conversation, our numbers are looking fairly stable when it comes to this demographic, but it's the non-consumer number, if we want to use that term, non-consumer, that number is continuing to go up. So non-consumers of higher education, where as we look out, 5-10 years, that's getting upwards of about 60%, somewhere in that range of folks that are looking at higher ed, and either the perception is changing on the value of higher education, looking at the debt that a student would take into account, take on in regards to a higher education. And so those are all playing factors in this enrollment shift. So yes, there are some roller coaster years ahead for us, not as significantly as previously projected. But when you do look down the road, with an increase in non-consumers, with the hourly rate, when you look at the pay rate right now, you can go and work for $17, $18 an hour. Students are deciding to take a gap year. That's something that we've seen from COVID. the likelihood of them saying, you know what, I'm going to take a year before making a decision, before taking on that debt, that is definitely a factor within a student's mind. And parents are more amenable to it than I would say pre-COVID. You know, some families where the mindset was you graduate from high school and you're going to go right into either a 2-year or 4-year institution. I think families are a little bit more amenable to allowing their student to stay home, get a job, make an hourly wage that, you know, is $16, $17 an hour. I mean, when you look at a 4-year graduate compared to a student right now that has not attended a 4-year institution or graduated from a 4-year institution, the annual income is only off by about $5,000 to $6,000. I believe it's somewhere in the range of 30 to 35,000. 30,000 being the student that has opted not to go to college, 35,000 for that student that has decided to go to college. However, long term, it's that long term return on investment that is going to be the differentiator. However, the mindset right now is more in the short term. So when I'm talking to students, I might approach students with different facts, talking about the student experience. Whereas if I'm talking to parents and guardians, I might be talking more in regards to that return on investment. You know, how Drake is #1 private institution in the state and how 10 years out, Drake is #1 when it comes to median income, you know, so that people understand that this is a good place to make an investment in your student's education.
I wonder, there's a couple of things. So just to be clear, when you say non-consumer, you mean people who graduate from high school and then do not go on to a post high school education. And
Correct.
that's 60% of high school graduates in Iowa.
No, I'm sorry, 40%.
Okay.
You're looking at over the next 5 to 10 years, you're looking at that number to come down about 40%.
Okay. And then I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
No, I'm sorry.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. You were talking about students who take a gap year, and you know the wages are such now that you can go and get a job and make some money. I wonder how much the economy plays into that, or you know, just they're thinking like, you know, I just need to make some money because I, you know, whatever, maybe their life situation or something. And then do you see a lot of students who then take that gap year and enroll at Drake or at the Regents universities? I don't know if you can track that.
Yeah, so what we did notice was a number of students around 2022, 2023, they would defer their enrollment for a year. And we're talking 30 to 40 students, upwards. I think we had one year where there were about 50 students that opted to defer for a year, take that gap year, and then either they did decide to come to Drake University or they went off to another institution, or some decided to just stay in the workforce. You know, they found something that they're enjoying. There isn't as much pressure. The headlines in regards to students taking on debt, they say, you know what, I want to be a little bit more risk averse to that. But we did see that number go up, whereas pre-COVID, you know, gap years weren't as common. They just weren't.
Jason, I don't know if you have any data around students who maybe take a gap year or take some time off and then enroll.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the Iowa SLDS, statewide longitudinal data system, that's able to track whether students enroll within a year of high school graduation. And that number did go up a little bit, but honestly, not quite as much as we had expected it to, particularly during COVID. But it's hard to know whether that started any new trends. I do agree with Jerry, though, that I think more people are giving the in-state option a chance, and you're seeing a huge growth at kind of public flagships at many, many states across the country. Schools that have become very selective that maybe not 20 years ago were not as much. Like University of Georgia has seen record applications and enrollments because more and more people are looking, maybe reflected upon COVID and saw the value of staying in state. I mean, the other big thing I would say that was a COVID effect for us was pre-COVID, there were an awful lot of pundits that were saying online education is going to be the future of higher education. That's going to be a way of making everything cheaper, making everything better. And I think we all learned that online is not a cure-all for everything. And our students were just overjoyed to get back and be with other students with masks off on campus. So it was one of those where it's It's like it's a reminder that we're social beings, and having that ability to socialize is a very important part of students' college experience and development.
Yeah, just because we can do things online doesn't mean it's our preferred method.
Right. It works great for lots of things, and we've gotten a lot better at it, but that still doesn't quite replace in person.
I just one follow-up. With the number, as the balance of students from out of state, in state changes, maybe especially for the regents and other universities in other states, there's that price difference. So I would think that from the university's perspective, pulling a student from Illinois to come to the University of Iowa, you're getting more money than pulling another Iowa student to go to the University of Iowa. So there's got to be, I mean, that's less money, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, and for some states that's caused some pretty big rifts because they see it as being displacing in-state students. However, with our automatic admission system for the three Iowa universities, we take everybody who's qualified, so you're never being displaced by an out-of-state student. If you meet the minimum 245 index score on the RAI, you're admitted, and we have to adjust as universities. So we're not displacing any in-state kids. We're just bringing in more out-of-state, which does bring in more money for the universities and brings more money for the state.
I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to talk about FAFSA because Jerry, I think you brought that up. The session right before this one was all about FAFSA, so I don't want to spend half the session talking about it, but I think it figures into this conversation, and that was the federal application for free student aid, or no, free application for federal student aid, excuse me. Um, there was a redesign of it that was rolled out poorly and resulted in um, headaches for students and institutions as there was a delay in deciding or figuring out what aid was available for students and then letting students know about that aid. And so that may have delayed them making a decision. If I've bungled any of that, please correct me. But Jerry, I wanted to start with you. How did that impact Drake and your enrollment this fall?
Yeah, absolutely. It did have an impact on our enrollment. I mean, we had one of the highest years in regards to applications to our institution, but that yield rate just the comparison between the applications and our yield rate didn't come to the overall objective that we were hoping for. And when I talked to other colleagues at other institutions, very much in the similar territories. FAFSA, people need to know what type of scholarship package, what type of aid they're going to be receiving, especially when it comes to a private institution. And so when there's delays on that, eventually people's patience wears out. And the likelihood of them deciding I'm either going to go to a 2-year college or I'm going to go to a regent institution where I know that it's probably going to be a little bit more affordable for me, depending on what their aid package looks like, I'm going to go there. And so by and large, the students that we've lost have gone to state institutions just off of the initial outlook that we've done because they're able to plan accordingly. Whereas as FAFSA just continued that perpetual delay, we just knew that was going to hit our deposit number. And so all institutions look at what the entering first year EFR deposit, what that looks like. And as FAFSA took longer to roll out, you could just see those numbers start coming off of your deposits. I mean, they've elected to go to another institution. By and large, we've seen greater competition for us as a private institution with the regent institutions. And so that just came to fruition even more so this past year.
Do you think there will be an opportunity to get those students back to Drake in your situation?
There's always an opportunity. It depends on what the student is looking for. If the student is looking for a more mid-size experience, not necessarily a small institution, not necessarily a large institution, then there's always that chance that student might elect to transfer into Drake University. It might not be the experience that they were hoping for. Drake might have been top of their list. It's just that it took too much time for them and they wanted to make a decision. And so maybe year 2, they decide to come back to our institution. It's hard to say. It really is. It really depends on what that student is really looking for in their college experience. And so, I don't know if Jason has the crystal ball there to say whether or not, I don't know what that looks like in regards to first year, second year, if they have any data to show if students do leave Regent institutions, where are they likely to go?
We do track that, and it's a little bit of a mixed bag. We have students that are going to other Regent universities, that go to the community colleges, but also go to private schools like Drake.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it probably just depends on individual situations.
Jason, I wanted to ask you, because it sounds like from Drake's perspective, like maybe they lost some students to the Regents, but I wondered how the FAFSA rollout affected the Regents universities.
I think FAFSA thing made the whole admission cycle for pretty much all colleges and universities a nightmare. And I think as a parent of a kid was going through the whole application process, it was certainly a nightmare for me, and the uncertainty. And even for folks that didn't qualify for financial aid, it delayed the process by many, many months and just drug the whole thing out. It did not impact our enrollment as much as we thought it would. Kind of to Jerry's point, we had one of the directors of admissions for one of our universities said that people were more willing to commit to them quicker than they expected, partly because we don't offer as much merit aid, or the merit aid we do is fairly transparent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you kind of know what your price is ahead of time. And I think it made it easier for people to maybe make a commit when everything else is up in the air. Like, well, there's a chance I'll be less expensive at Drake, but I know what the price will be at Iowa State. So maybe I'll pick Iowa State this time. And maybe Drake has a good chance of getting them to go back. I don't know. The one thing that FAFSA seemed like it did do, even once all the dust has settled, is Pell eligible numbers are up. First generation students are up nationally. And that was one of the intent of kind of redoing the FAFSA and kind of changing the way money is awarded. So that's a good thing, but it was an awful lot of mess to get to that good thing.
Yeah, lots of pain to get to that. We've talked some about student behavior trends, and Jerry, you alluded to changing the way that you go out and recruit students and putting recruiters in different places. Can you talk a little bit about how Drake has changed that process? Are you recruiting more students from inside the state? Did you used to leave the state to try to recruit out-of-state students? How has that changed?
Sure. Yeah, so we do. We have recruiters here that are based in our Des Moines campus, but we also have regional recruiters based in other locations throughout the country. For example, Chicagoland area, Texas, we have 2. One of our recruiters in Texas also focuses in on the Denver population, so Colorado. Looking at Minnesota, Minnesota has become harder to recruit from. They have a very advantageous program up there to keep their students home in their home state. So what we have looked at is, as our numbers continue to go up when it comes to the Iowa population, to really double down. And as we're seeing growth through our Des Moines public schools and then the greater Des Moines metro area, having those relationships and partnerships with those schools has paid off quite significantly for us. It's also been the same case for our transfer population. So students that have elected to go into maybe one of the community colleges here in the state, strengthening those partnerships, making it more seamless for a student to transfer into a 4-year institution, less headaches and so on, has helped us in regards to having a sizable increase in our transfer population in that pipeline. So we have had to look at where do we have our regional counselors? What are we doing here in the Des Moines area? and then looking at what some of our peer institutions are doing. By and large, we keep an eye out and try to surmise, where is this institution going next? Looking at not only here in the state of Iowa, but surrounding states. I mean, you're seeing reciprocity agreements between states. That's only going to continue to increase as some states have larger demographic shifts in the years ahead. I can only assume it's going to get more competitive there. But you're also seeing private institutions enter into reciprocity agreements as well in regards to trying to honor what their tuition is and bringing that across state lines. Now, the difference between private and public institutions is if you're coming from Illinois, you're paying the same tuition technically that you'd be paying if you're coming from Des Moines, Iowa, whereas at region institutions, that's not the case.
So when you say you've developed these relationships with like metro area high schools, are you spending more time in the schools? Are
Yeah.
you like trying to get students familiar with what Drake is? Like maybe they've heard of it, but they don't know much about it. Is that kind of the focus?
Absolutely. So
Okay.
having those on the ground individuals, building relationships, not only with the counselors, but with our teachers and with other administrative staff that have gone through Drake, having more events here on campus, making sure that there are no fences surrounding the Drake University campus, but sometimes people can envision that there's this fence that prevents our local communities from coming in, and it's saying no, there is no fence. We need to make sure that people know that this is their campus too. That Drake University is Des Moines' hometown campus, and so we want to make sure that we can do everything we can to have those students get a feel for who we are as an institution. Is this the right institution for them? Is it accessible for them? And making sure that those programs and initiatives that we roll out attracts them. And not only get them here, but to retain them here. That is the critical part of all of this, is also the retention part. As we're seeing smaller numbers potentially come in, we got to retain those smaller numbers.
I want to follow up with you, Jason. Can you tell us a little bit about how the regents are attracting students, and what advantages or disadvantages do you think that Iowa State, you and I have for attracting students compared to the smaller private colleges?
Sure. I mean, we tend to be a lot larger, and so with larger schools, you tend to have more opportunities for different things. I mean, my son's an engineering major at a large university, and he's part of a Formula One race car competition team on his campus. Something that some small schools are able to do, but not as many. So that's the sort of thing. Iowa State has something that's similar. They have big time sports and some of the things that go with it. So we have kind of a built-in advertising. So everyone knows who the University of Iowa and Iowa State are because they see the teams on TV. In fact, I know University of Iowa talked a little bit about a Caitlin Clark bump in admissions over this last year, even though folks knew that Caitlin Clark wasn't going to be at the University of Iowa. I was just like, oh, well, they associate those things. Like that must be a great place because they've got such a great student athlete there. I think the automatic admissions has been helpful for us. The way our current setup is, typically within about an hour of applying, students know whether they've been admitted or not, which takes away a lot of the stress. Particularly when I talk to out-of-state parents, they're kind of shocked by that.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, well, we applied, but we're hoping to hear within the next week. I'm like, well, you should check your email. It said, did you get an email after you applied? Like, well, yeah, we assumed that was just an email saying that they'd received our application. Like, no, that was the acceptance. And so they go back and check their inbox and like, oh yeah, okay. But that advantage is eroding a bit because there's a lot of schools and a lot of states. For example, like Minnesota, Jerry was talking about, are now sending letters to students saying, you have been automatically admitted to these 15 colleges in your state. You just need to basically let us know which one you want to go to, and you're all ready to go.
Without even applying.
Without even applying.
Wow.
So that is a growing trend across the country as well. So the University of Minnesota Twin Cities does not participate in that, but I think almost every other school does in the state of Minnesota.
And that's just based on data that's available to them about students?
Yep.
Wow. Well, I could see where if you are a first generation college student or prospective, um, and you don't know much about accessing higher ed, to get that letter and know, oh, I'm already accepted. That could be, there's one barrier that's gone.
Mhm.
That very much is our target group. And it is, I know for Minnesota, it's like students who are like, well, I'm not college material. And then you receive a letter saying, no, you actually are. And here's how you can go about going if you feel like that's a good fit for your future goals.
Yeah. Um, Jerry, you brought up retention, and I did want to talk about that a bit because we talked about it in our pre-meeting before this session
Yeah.
that, it's one thing to get students there, but it's another thing entirely to keep them enrolled at the school. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about why retention is important to Drake. I mean, beyond just the obvious that you want to keep students there. And then what are some of the things that you're doing to try to keep students there for their entire college career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, outside the obvious, I mean, retention helps us out in order to fulfill the mission of the institution, and that is, having the resources available to us to make sure that we are living out our academic mission, the co-curricular experience, all those things that lead to civic and professional development of our students for lifelong learning. Um, so when it comes to what we're trying to do is when we see a demographic that has historically been underrepresented on our campus, we've launched several initiatives. One, for example, being our Crew Scholars program, which is working with our Black and Brown students. As a cohort-based model, we've expanded that from a cohort-based 25 to 75 students coming into that model. We see that the retention numbers are equal to, and actually in some ways surpass the retention of our first year to second year retention rate. Why? Because they're building affinity. They're seeing that they have the resources and the staffing, the faculty that are there that are dedicated to making sure that the transition into Drake University, that they're not doing this on their own, that they have peer mentors, they have faculty and staff mentors along the way. I mean, when you look at our athletic teams, we are a Division I program here in the state of Iowa, nationally part of the Missouri Valley Conference. And so looking at those numbers, our retention rate is very high when it comes to our athletic programs, that affinity that's being built. Our fraternity and sorority life, different than what you might see at some of the larger public institutions, not just here in the state of Iowa, but across the board, across other states as well, where those students aren't just affiliated with a Greek organization, they're involved in so many other things, whether it's being a student ambassador, whether it's being on mock trial or student government. Those types of opportunities build that connection, build that affinity back to the institution, where we have a greater likelihood, if they're getting involved, that we're going to retain those students and that they're going to matriculate. And so when you look across the board, whether it's a 4-year or 6-year matriculation rate, I mean, that's why Drake is so high when it comes to our 6-year matriculation rate, is because of all the opportunities that we present to them. We're not as large as the state institutions, but we do have a plethora of opportunities for our students when it comes to their co-curricular involvement, taking what they're learning, taking the theory in the classroom and applying that practically into those co-curricular experiences, and then building those relationships amongst our student body. That's just so important. So when they get here, we need to be just as intentional as we were when we were recruiting them to make sure that they know that there's a place here for them, that there are opportunities. There are countless numbers of times I could tell you that I've met with students, either a parent is called or a flag has been raised saying the student is having a tough time getting acclimated to the culture. And that's one of the benefits that we have as being a smaller private institution, where we're bringing that student in and we're providing them different opportunities and saying, what does this look like? Does this put some pep in your step? Is this something that's attractive for you? And I'm not saying that other larger institutions don't do that. It's just that we're on the ground. It's a smaller population, so we have the ability to have those one-on-one conversations with them when it looks like things are kind of going sideways.
Yeah. Um, and definitely not because the Regents universities aren't trying.
No, they
Jason,
are.
obviously it looks very different. I went to two of the Regents universities. It looks different at a bigger school like in Iowa or Iowa State, even UNI. But what are the Iowa State universities doing to try to retain students and get them through and graduated and successful in their careers?
Yeah, So I think we've known for years that we're larger and that it can be easier to become a number. And we've done a lot of things to try to address that. I'll just give a couple quick examples, but like the living learning communities are something that was started in a big way at Iowa State, spread to the other universities as well. It's a chance to kind of live in the residence hall with other folks that are interested in similar majors or similar kind of areas to you. You take some of your classes just with that smaller group, and again, based on the affinity groups you've got, you tend to have a faculty mentor. We've run the numbers for it. You've got a 7 percentage point increase in your chances of earning a degree by having lived in a living learning community versus not. And that holds true, even though I think Iowa State now has about 85% of their students now live in a living learning community. So they're kind of, we do things to make the experience small because there are inherent benefits with that small, intimate kind of setting. So we try to work to do that. The other thing that has become 50 years ago, it was a lot of the look to your left, look to your right. One of you is not going to be here at the end of the semester, sort of like weeding people out. And we offer so much in the way of like tutoring, supplementary instruction. Like when we admit a student, we admit students who we think are going to succeed. And we consider it a failure if they don't. And life happens, things happen. And even places like Harvard do not have a 100% retention rate. However, we are working hard to keep those students. One, just from a kind of a moral standpoint, we want to support those students and see them succeed. But also, there's an economic benefit. It's cheaper to keep students than it is to go out and recruit new ones all the time. And we take a model of, if you've gotten in the door, we should be able to keep you. And so we try to do that.
And especially like we've talked about, there are fewer students coming to the colleges and universities anyway. So when you do get them, hanging on to them seems like it's very important.
It's vital. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of these issues, the FAFSA, the student life, all these things. College is really expensive. Like in some cases, it's more than $50,000 a year, which is just mind-boggling. But at least at the private colleges, most students aren't paying that like sticker price, I guess we could call it. Jerry, could you talk a little bit about the difference between like what we see, in news stories or on websites where this is how much it costs to attend Drake University for a year versus what students are actually paying? Like, why is there such a difference there?
Sure. Yeah, when it comes to public institutions, private institutions participate in this thing called tuition discounting. And so ultimately what that means is you may have a sticker price of $50,000, okay, to come to Drake University, okay. Institutions will then discount that, and a student will pay, maybe 50, 60, 70, 80%. Some institutions are above 80% in regards to discounting what their MSRP is. Okay. Part of that is to stay competitive with other institutions, other private schools, to stay comparable to our public institutions as well, because we're very conscientious knowing that students have those options. I think Jason and I can both agree that we want to retain students. We want to keep students from crossing the border and stay right here in Iowa, whether they choose to go to the region institutions or they come to a private. I mean, ideally, we want them to stay in the state of Iowa to get their degree. So when it comes down to this, institutions then look at what is their net tuition revenue. And so what you're starting to see more institutions go to, private schools, is these, AGI, adjusted gross index of 80,000 or 100,000. And if you qualify there, then you're going to get free tuition to that private school A or private school B. And so you're seeing more institutions that are offering free tuition at the private school level. What they're hoping for is the volume to go up. So they're really hoping that that's going to attract more students to offset the discounting rate and their net tuition, because ultimately that's what it comes down to when you're putting together your budget, your operational budget for the year, is looking at How do we bank off of this net tuition forecast? And so what schools are relying on is that they're filling out the FAFSA. There's a commitment there by most institutions. They're filling out the ITG, the Iowa Tuition Grant. Those institutions receive those dollars. And then some institutions are then requiring that the student live on campus. And what that does is that is additional revenue for that institution that they might not have received. So, now it's more palatable for a private school to say, hey, if your AGI is 80,000 or below or 100,000 or below, the Pell grant as well as ITG funds, it's more palatable. Whereas it used to be probably $6,000-$7,000 difference. Now you're looking at anywhere from a $2,300 to $2,500 difference on the cost for that student. So that's why you're starting to see more private institutions enter this space. And then on top of it, you get room and board, whereas the cost of the room is most of these dorms, residence halls are paid off. So it's the operational cost, but that's a significant amount of gross revenue for that institution, as well as percentage they get from board. I can tell you, not one student at Drake University pays full MSRP. So you can go to our website right now, take a look at what the sticker price is. Not one student is paying that. And by and large, I could probably say the same for just about every other private institution in the state. Even if you have the means, you're still not paying it. What it was 10, 15, 20 years ago, it's totally different now.
Do you think maybe that scares some students and families away, not knowing that's how it is? They see the sticker price and they don't understand that there's a whole other, like there are all these discounts and scholarships and yeah.
Absolutely. I think it does. And I think that's where you have to be more intentional and on the ground when you're working with students and their parents, their families, to explain this. Some people will say, well, why not just charge what the actual cost is? Well, the thing about it is students, when you're out there recruiting and you're building scholarships and merit aid packages, they might get a different level of funding based on a quintile system. How high achieving is that student? What is their SEC? So depending on where those come in, they might get a different merit aid package than another student. So institutions that have gone to this tuition reset, you've seen a number of examples throughout the country in the last 5-10 years. By and large, 3 to 5 years out, they're back to where they started. Okay, because they're awarding everybody the same thing, and at the end of the day, it's not adding up. Okay, because once again, yes, we're trying to recruit the same student, so to speak, but it comes in different packages. And I'm probably making this more confusing as I continue to talk about this. But yes, intentionality, you really need to focus in on it, that people are not paying full sticker price. And so as people are looking at private schools, just know that that's not the price you're going to pay.
Right. Well, and it sounds like that's where some of your getting out into the schools and building relationships plays in, and being able to share that message that, listen, if you look at the website, it says this, but keep talking to me and you're not going to pay that much. Yeah. Jason, obviously the situation is quite different at the Regents universities. But you have the advantage of having a lower sticker price. So what's the situation for Iowa's public universities?
Well, what's trickier for us is, so merit aid, you could make a case for being a kind of a discount. And so we do offer some merit aid through the universities. Iowa State, over the last couple of years, has become very transparent in your merit aid. You can go online right now and find out exactly how much merit aid your student would get. Based on like ACT scores or high school GPA or the combination of the two. And so I think that's great. I applaud the transparency. The other two universities do it slightly differently. But there are schools like the University of Alabama, a public institution, that have gotten large amounts of money from their state, and they are throwing around huge merit aid. And so we have to try to compete with that. So more and more of these public universities are providing huge discounts, kind of along the lines of what the privates used to do. And to some extent, we will try to compete as best we can with that. But a lot of that comes down to the funding that's available for the universities to do, because a lot of these merit aid packages are self-funded, and so we don't have a lot of, and we don't get a lot of need-based aid from the state.
So I'm gonna have to skip over some of the other questions I had written because we have just, I think, 6 minutes left. But I wanted to flash forward and ask you both, even though no one has a crystal ball and knows what's coming, but what do you think the future of Iowa's higher education landscape is going to look like? I mean, I think we didn't get into well, I guess we mentioned, or I think Jason, or I can't remember who mentioned it, about smaller schools, some of them closing. Obviously, there are others that are facing financial difficulty, and it seems like we will have fewer colleges in Iowa. But what do you think it's going to look like? What's going to be available to students who graduate in 5 years from high school or 10 years? Whomever wants to start, go ahead.
Yeah, I go ahead and start. I mean, again, there's no way to predict like who's going to succeed and who's not, but we are for the first time in a number of decades, we're seeing the number of high school graduates going down, which is going to, I think, cause belt tightening at the very minimum, for colleges and universities across the country. And we have already seen some closures, so I suspect there will be more in the future. I honestly do not know how many, but I think there's if you have fewer students that you're being chased by the same number of schools, I think that's going to be inevitable. Strangely, we're seeing huge growth at the most highly selective colleges. Mm-hmm. I think it's because as people are become more debt averse, they're willing to go into debt for kind of the big names. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a factor, I think, as well going forward. And I will say, the one other thing I was going to offer is that there's some good if you've got a family member who's looking to go to college in the next 5 or 6 years, because it's a buyer's market. Again, there are colleges and universities chasing fewer and fewer students. And so the chances of being able to maybe find a better deal for students who are graduating from high school kind of between 2027 and 2031 are pretty good. So that's the silver lining maybe to look for.
It is for me as someone who has 2 children graduating from high school in those years.
All right, then.
Jerry, what do you see as the landscape? Or, I mean, if you want to get specific to Drake and what you think, I don't know, whatever you want to predict.
Well, I'll keep it more generalized and not focus so much on Drake. I know not everyone here wants to hear about Drake's story.
No, we do. We all do.
For the conversation, but Jason's exactly right. I do think there are going to be clearly there are going to be changes coming down the pike. I would suspect that there'll probably be fewer institutions in 5 years. We've already seen some of those closures happen here in the state. I would suspect that will probably continue to happen in some degree. I don't want to prognosticate on what that number looks like. But I do see that there is this race at the private institution level about the tuition discounting, and that number continually going up. I mean, it is going up. And so, it takes dollars to run these institutions and to deliver on the academic mission. A lot of these campuses are older, they're pre-1900s, deferred maintenance, making sure that you're recruiting and retaining faculty and staff. Those are real costs. And so, the concern I have is if we continue to really just put a lot into this discounting model, we need to come up with something different. I don't have that solution. And I can tell you, when I was doing my PhD work over 10 years ago, I met with a lot of college presidents. They didn't know what the solution was either. But we're all trying to really thread this small needle. And to do it in a way that keeps us competitive. Also, what separates us from the pack? What separates us from other institutions? So I really do think that, if an institution is going to make investments, I mean, double down on those things that you do extremely well. Make sure you really double down on those things and get the word out on what you do. I mean, when it comes to accomplishment rates, Here's what I'll say about Drake. Our accomplishment rate is extremely high. 97.8% of our students, 6 months out, they have a job, they're in their career, they're in graduate school. Here's what I'll tell you. The response rate is 94%. Families should always ask the question, that's great, Drake, 97.8%. How many people responded to that survey? We confidently say 94%. That's not just statistically significant. As my old professor, stats professor would say, that's highly significant. That stands out. So really double down on those things that you do really well and explore what are some of those opportunities, and do you have the investments in order to make sure you do them well? I mean, people don't want to just see you doing something. They want to make sure that there is going to be that return and that student experience that everyone's entrusting you with when their student comes to a college or university. So interesting times. I tend to be an optimist. Yes, there are going to be some bumps, but we're going to have to really be collaborative in how we navigate it. But I am optimistic about the future.
That's good. We are out of time. Thank you, Jason, Jerry, for sharing your knowledge and expertise on this topic. I really appreciate it. And the recording of this session will be available on iowaideas.com either later this week or early next week. So thank you and enjoy Iowa Ideas.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.